On July 20th, 1871, British Columbia became Canada's 6th province. The province and the Dominion had agreed to 14 terms of union, which over the next 2 decades were eventually fulfilled. BC's Confederation and the terms of union have lasting effects today. Take a look around you. Things that you encounter in your day-to-day life, such as mail service, fisheries management, the Coast Guard, and the military, are all things that the federal government is responsible for in British Columbia. Their existence in our province is a direct result of the choice to join Canada in 1871. In this video, part 2 of our series on Confederation, we focus on 2 articles from the Terms of Union. Article 12, the construction of the graving dock at Esquimalt, and Article 13, which laid out federal jurisdiction over First Nations people. The O'Reilly family and their relatives, the Trutch family, were involved in the enactment of these particular articles from the Terms of Union. In this way, the legacy of Confederation is also a part of the story of Point Ellice House. Due in no small part to his commitment to Confederation, Canadian Prime Minister John A. Macdonald appointed Joseph Trutch as the first Lieutenant Governor of the new province. During his first year in the position, Trutch meddled in the workings of government, even though he was supposed to be upholding the representative government fought for in the Confederation debates by men like de Cosmos. To their frustration, Trutch exercised his authority as the unelected lieutenant governor by selecting the first premier and residing over government policy meetings. Although BC was a representative government on paper, the first election held in 1871 granted only white men who owned or leased property the ability to vote. Women, First Nations, and Chinese peoples were excluded for many decades. In 1876, Trutch's role as lieutenant governor ended. However, Macdonald reappointed him as a federal representative for British Columbia in 1880. In this position, Trutch oversaw the construction of the BC portion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, at last fulfilling Article 11 of the Terms of Union in 1885. He was also responsible for seeing through the completion of the Island Railway and the Esquimalt Graving Dock, and he continued to meddle in First Nations policy. It is clear that even though an elected assembly was established for the province, men like Trutch still held the balance of power. Trutch's post-Confederation roles allowed him to sustain his own self-interest and the interest of the former colonial, now provincial, elite. The Esquimalt Graving Dock was completed on July 20th, 1887, exactly 16 years after Confederation. The construction of the dry dock allowed for commercial and naval ships to be maintained and repaired locally, thus fulfilling Article 12 of the Terms of Union. The insertion of this project into the Terms of Union reveals the self-interest of the social and political elite in British Columbia. For example, Henry Creese, then a judge on the Supreme Court of British Columbia, also acted as an agent for the Colonial Securities Company Limited of London. He directed the company's attention and money to investments in infrastructure projects like the graving dock and railways. There was a profit to be made from the fulfillment of this particular article. At the grand opening of the graving dock, the British colonist noted that it was attended by members of the Dominion Senate, the provincial government and assembly, the civic council, a large number of leading citizens, together with a sprinkling of the fair sex. Included among members of the provincial government and leading citizens were Joseph Trutch and Frank O'Reilly, the eldest son of Peter and Caroline O'Reilly. Frank, at just 17 years of age, had become involved in surveying the area for dock construction in 1884. His involvement with the project is no doubt due to his familial connections, as Joseph Trutch was his uncle. Among those present of the fair sex were Trutch's wife Julia, his niece Grace Davy, and Frank's sister Kathleen O'Reilly. Frank noted in his diary that Aunt Julia and Grace started everything, referring to his aunt as the one to switch on the ponderous pumps at the dock. He also remarked upon the blue ribbon, which was ceremonially cut by Kathleen to mark the occasion. Frank O'Reilly got his start as a surveyor with this job, and with the experience he gained, he would go on to map and track water sources for industrial operations from 1892 to 1904. Trutch's wife and 2 of his nieces were key players in the ceremony, a testament to the influence of the Trutch family in the new province, and the dock itself was a visual symbol of the continually growing power and influence of settler society in British Columbia. Following Confederation in 1871, British Columbia continued with its status quo approach to First Nations lands. The vague wording of Article 13 called for an Indian policy
as liberal as that hitherto pursued by the British Columbia government,
which meant the continuance of policies which denied treaties, slowly set out small reserves, and favored settler claims to land. Eventually, BC's disregard for First Nations land matters no longer satisfied the Dominion government, who called for a proper settling of what was often referred to as the Indian land question. They required that British Columbia undertake a process to lay out reserves for First Nations. In 1876, the Dominion and provincial governments appointed 3 men to do this job. Alexander Caulfield Anderson represented the Dominion, Archibald McKinley the province, and Gilbert Malcolm Sprout was the joint appointee. This first attempt to allocate reserves across the province was fraught with disagreement and frustration. McKinley was seen as too stingy by Canada, and Anderson as too generous by BC. Sprout, as the joint appointee, had to contend with the opposing ideas of land allocation held by the Dominion and the province. Few agreements were reached by this 3-man commission, and by 1880 all eventually left their positions, leaving the question of reserves in BC still unsettled. When the time came to appoint a new Indian Reserve Commissioner, Trutch advised Prime Minister Macdonald to appoint someone they could trust to make swift decisions that would satisfy both the Dominion and the province, his brother-in-law, Peter O'Reilly. O'Reilly's appointment to this role in 1880 was intended to ease tensions in the fledgling relationship between the province and Canada, and it also had the added benefit of costing the Dominion less than employing another candidate would have. Peter O'Reilly came out of the comfortable retirement afforded him by Article 6 of the Terms of Union in order to take this role, but he continued to collect his pension, which meant that he would not need to be paid a full salary for this work. After the chaos and costliness of the failed 3-man commission, the Dominion was glad to have the role filled with little additional cost to government coffers. As Indian Reserve Commissioner, O'Reilly was responsible for assigning reserve lands without treaty, and many First Nations reported that he set out reserves hastily and without due consultation. In several cases, he assigned reserves while leaders were absent. O'Reilly allocated more than 600 reserves across British Columbia, satisfying the Dominion's request to settle the land question and open up the province to settlement and industry. His decisions shaped the British Columbia we see on the map today. He traveled the province from 1880 to 1898, returning to Point Ellice House to make decisions that would have devastating impacts on First Nations peoples. According to Nicholas Claxton and John Price, Article 13 provided the BC government a constitutional chokehold over Indigenous affairs, which remains embedded in the Canadian Constitution to this day. The choices of a small group of settlers, heavily influenced by their own self-interest, led the colony of British Columbia down the path to Confederation, and Claxton notes that after Confederation, British Columbia ignored Indigenous title and denied Indigenous sovereignty. Trutch was a leading architect for First Nations dispossession before Confederation with Canada, and Article 13 ensured this would continue when Canada took over jurisdiction. In 1876, the Dominion government implemented the Indian Act, setting the stage for policies and laws that controlled every aspect of Indigenous peoples' lives. Today, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls on us to reject the concepts that were used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples. The decision made by British Columbia's colonial elite to join Canada, to sign on to the BNA Act, and to specifically include Article 13 enabled dispossession. Peter O'Reilly, Joseph Trutch, their families, and their colleagues all benefited greatly from the Terms of Union. Article 12, which brought about the construction of the graving dock, reflects the self-interest of the provincial elite and their desire to demonstrate power and influence after 1871. The dock is still in use today, a symbol of the province's colonial history and its decision to join with Canada. The fulfillment of the Terms of Union, Articles 12 and 13 in particular, directly connect Point Ellice House and its past occupants to the history of Confederation and the long-standing effects which continue to impact people in British Columbia today.